The United States just lifted sanctions on 140 million barrels of Iranian oil. The Treasury Department issued a general license allowing the purchase of Iranian crude currently sitting on tankers at sea. Buyers worldwide can now legally purchase the oil of the country the United States is actively bombing. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent framed it with a sentence that deserves to be read slowly. He said, "In essence, we will be using the Iranian barrels against Tehran to keep the price down as we continue Operation Epic Fury." That is the Treasury Secretary publicly stating that the government will allow its enemy to sell oil on the open market in order to suppress the price crisis that its own military operation created. That is not a contradiction buried in classified documents. That is a contradiction posted on social media by the man who made the decision. And it gets worse. This is the third time in just over 2 weeks that the Treasury Department has temporarily suspended sanctions on oil from American adversaries. The first was Russian oil, now Iranian oil. The same Iranian oil that was under maximum pressure sanctions, specifically because Washington designated Iran as the head of the snake for global terrorism. Those are Bessent's own words from the same announcement. The head of the snake for global terrorism, and the Treasury's solution to the oil crisis is to allow that snake to sell 140 million barrels of crude on the open market at over $100 a barrel. The math on this is not complicated. Brent crude settled at $112 a barrel on Friday. 140 million barrels at that price is approximately $15.7 billion in potential revenue. Bessent claimed that Iran will have difficulty accessing any of that money because of separate sanctions cutting Tehran off from the global financial system. But Gregory Brew, a senior analyst at Eurasia Group who specializes in oil and gas, told CNN that Iran is expected to reap some amount of profit from selling the barrels in a market where prices have climbed by more than a third since the war began. China, which is the largest importer of Iranian crude, stands to gain the most from the temporary measure. Bessent himself acknowledged this. He said the move would prevent China from continuing to hoard Iranian oil on the cheap, but the mechanism he chose to stop that hoarding is to make the oil available to everyone, including the countries whose purchases will generate the revenue that flows back toward Tehran. Stay with me because the layers of contradiction here go deeper than the oil itself. And this is the part of the story that connects Friday's Treasury decision to the military operation, the Strait of Hormuz, and a war that is now visibly outrunning the government that started it. The reason oil is at $112 is not a mystery. The United States and Israel launched a war against one of the world's largest oil-producing nations on February the 28th. Iran responded by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway that carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade. Before the war, 138 ships transited the strait daily. That number has collapsed to nearly zero for Western-aligned shipping. On March the 2nd, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officially confirmed the strait was closed. By March the 5th, protection and indemnity insurance for war risk was pulled from the strait entirely, making transit economically impossible regardless of military conditions. Iran did not need to sink a single tanker. It weaponized commercial risk. A few drone strikes, a couple of burning vessels, and the global insurance industry made the decision to stop on its own. Then on March the 18th, Israel struck Iran's South Pars gas field, the largest natural gas reserve on the planet. Iran retaliated by hitting Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, the largest liquefied natural gas facility on Earth, and by striking the Bazan Group oil refinery complex in Haifa, and by hitting refineries in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The chief executive of Qatar Energy said some Ras Laffan facilities could be offline for up to 5 years. 17% of global liquefied natural gas capacity was disrupted in a single day. Brent crude surged past $119. European gas prices spiked 35%. And Kuwait's Minat al-Ahmadi refinery, the country's largest, was hit by Iranian drones for the second consecutive day on Friday morning, with fires burning at multiple operational units. That is the energy landscape that produced Friday night's sanctions decision. The war created the crisis. The crisis created the price spike. The price spike is now threatening American consumers, American businesses, and the political standing of the administration that launched the war. And the only tool left in the drawer is to ease sanctions on the country being bombed so that its oil can suppress the prices the bombing caused. The Washington Post framing was direct. The headline read, "Treasury Department has lifted sanctions on Iranian crude already loaded onto vessels. giving Iran's war effort against the United States a boost. That is an American newspaper describing an American government policy as boosting an enemy's war effort during an active military campaign. The absurdity is not editorial, it is structural. And this is where the economic toolkit starts to visibly collapse. The administration has already exhausted its standard options. CNN reported, citing 3 people familiar with internal discussions, that Trump officials now privately estimate higher prices could linger for months, especially as fighting intensifies and passage through the Strait of Hormuz remains nearly impossible. The United States has already released barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It has already eased sanctions on Russian oil at sea. It has already waived the Jones Act to allow foreign-flagged tankers to move fuel between American ports. It has already ruled out banning crude exports. And now it has lifted sanctions on Iranian oil. Beth Sanner, a former deputy director of national intelligence and CNN national security analyst, said at a CNN town hall on Friday that the administration is doing little tiny things that make it seem like they are doing something. She said the release of strategic reserves takes too long, over too much of a period of time, and is just not enough. She said the Iranian oil measure will not significantly lower prices. Energy analyst Brett Erickson, managing principal at Obsidian Risk Advisors, said the easing of sanctions raises concerns about the rapid depletion of Washington's economic toolkit. That phrase, rapid depletion, is doing serious work. 3 weeks into a war that was supposed to last 4 days, the administration has burned through every economic lever it has, and the prices have not come down. Brent crude was around $70 before the war. It closed Friday at $112. That is a 60% increase in 21 days. Goldman Sachs has suggested that elevated prices could last through 2027, not months, years. And here is the part that almost nobody has connected. The International Energy Agency published a report on Friday calling this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The agency issued emergency guidance urging people to work from home and avoid air travel. It recommended that governments reduce highway speed limits by at least 6 miles per hour. It said it could take months or even years to restore oil and gas flows from the region. This is the International Energy Agency, the institution created after the 1973 oil crisis specifically to prevent this kind of event, telling the world that the disruption exceeds anything in its 52-year history. And the disruption was caused by a war launched by one of the agency's own founding member states. That brings us to the strategic absurdity that sits underneath all of this. But first, the disruption is not limited to fuel. The Strait of Hormuz carries nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports. Those are the raw materials for nitrogen-based fertilizers. Those fertilizers produce the staple crops that supply more than 40% of global caloric intake. The Fertilizer Institute has stated this directly. The Northern Hemisphere spring planting season is approaching. Farmers across the world are now facing fertilizer costs that have surged since the strait closed. The United States Department of Agriculture announced on Friday an expansion of its Trade Disruption Customer Support Program to help producers and agribusinesses manage what it called unexpected market shocks. That program was originally created in March 2025 to help farmers hit by tariffs. It is now being repurposed to absorb the agricultural fallout of a war the same government launched 3 weeks ago. The food price chain runs from the Strait of Hormuz through fertilizer markets, through crop yields, through grocery shelves. And every day the strait stays closed, that chain tightens. Treasury Secretary Bessent says the administration is using Iranian barrels against Tehran. But follow the money. Iran loaded those barrels onto tankers before the war or during it. The oil exists. It is floating at sea. By lifting sanctions, Washington is allowing buyers, primarily in Asia, to purchase that oil at market price. The revenue, even if partially blocked by financial sanctions, flows toward Iran's economy. Some portion of it will reach the Iranian government. That government is currently using every dollar it can access to fund the missile production, the drone strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, and the Hormuz closure that created the price crisis in the first place. The logic is circular. America bombs Iran. Iran closes Hormuz, prices spike. America lifts sanctions on Iranian oil to suppress prices. Iran earns revenue from the sales. Iran uses the revenue to sustain the war effort that keeps Hormuz closed and prices high. And America responds by requesting $200 billion from Congress to continue bombing the country whose oil it is now allowing onto the market. Besant said, "We are winning this critical fight at an even faster pace than anticipated." On the same day that the International Energy Agency declared the largest supply disruption in history. On the same day that Goldman Sachs projected elevated prices through 2027. On the same day that a former deputy director of national intelligence said the administration's moves will not significantly lower prices. On the same day that Kuwait's largest refinery burned for the second day in a row. Winning, in this context, requires a definition that no official has provided. Meanwhile, more forces are heading toward the region, not away from it. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, at least 2,200 Marines, left San Diego on the USS Boxer and will reach the Persian Gulf in approximately 3 weeks. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit out of Okinawa is also heading to the region. These are amphibious assault capabilities. They are not configured for air operations. They are configured for ground insertion. Trump told reporters on Friday that the administration is considering winding down the war. On the same day that thousands of additional Marines shipped out. On the same day that the CBS reported the administration is strategizing methods to seize or extract Iran's nuclear materials in a potential ground operation. A senior Iranian source told CNN that Tehran does not believe the winding down claim. United States Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz defended the sanctions decision at a CNN town hall on Friday night. He described the move as very temporary and said it was designed to defeat the Iranian strategy of driving energy prices so high. He said the oil would go to allies like India, Japan, and others. He did not address the question of how much revenue Iran would earn from those sales or where that revenue would go. And there is one more detail that deserves attention. The sanctions waiver issued Friday night also covers Russian oil currently at sea. The same general license that permits the purchase of Iranian crude permits the purchase of Russian crude. The United States is fighting a war it says is partly about preventing Iran from destabilizing the Middle East, while simultaneously allowing both Iran and Russia to sell oil that funds their respective military operations. The European Union, which has spent 3 years trying to cut Russian energy revenue to weaken Moscow's war effort in Ukraine, is now watching the United States undercut that strategy by unsanctioning Russian barrels alongside Iranian ones. The geopolitical contradictions are stacking faster than any narrative can contain them. White House spokeswoman Taylor Rogers said that once the military objectives are completed, oil and gas prices will drop rapidly again, potentially even lower than before the strikes began. That statement assumes the military objectives will be completed. It assumes Hormuz will reopen. It assumes Gulf energy infrastructure will be rebuilt. It assumes the insurance industry will resume coverage. It assumes Iran's retaliatory capacity will be fully eliminated. It assumes none of the damage is permanent. Every one of those assumptions is currently contradicted by the evidence on the ground. Ras Laffan may be offline for 5 years. The strait remains closed. Iran launched at least a dozen salvos on Friday alone despite 3 weeks of sustained bombardment. And the new supreme leader has not made a single public appearance in 13 days, meaning nobody outside Tehran knows who is making targeting decisions or whether escalation authority is centralized or fragmented. The oil market is not responding to rhetoric. It is responding to the physical reality that 20% of global seaborne oil trade has been removed from the market, that major Gulf production facilities are burning, and that the government prosecuting the war has run out of economic tools to manage the consequences while the war is still accelerating. The United States is bombing Iran. The United States is buying Iran's oil. The United States says it is winning. The International Energy Agency says this is the largest supply disruption in recorded history. And the Treasury Secretary says the plan is to use Iranian oil against Iran while spending $200 billion to continue destroying the country that produced it. That is not a policy. That is a feedback loop. And nobody in Washington has explained how it ends. What do you think? Is lifting sanctions on Iranian oil mid-war a desperate move or a strategic one? Drop it in the comments. This one matters. This is Global Conflicts Dispatch. Subscribe. Back tomorrow.